The black SUVs arrived just after sunrise, rolling into the quiet neighborhood like a storm no one had invited. Doors opened in perfect unison, and 6 men in dark suits stepped onto the pavement while frightened neighbors watched from behind curtains. At the center of them stood Cashin Varelli, a feared underworld boss whose name could empty a room in seconds. He had come for one thing, his missing German shepherd, Atlas. But when Cashin reached the small white house at the end of the street, he found Atlas wrapped tightly around a crying plus-sized woman, his front paws resting across her shoulders as though he had spent his entire life protecting her. Cashin ordered the dog to return. Atlas looked directly at the men who had raised him, then did something so unexpected that every bodyguard lowered his hands in stunned silence. Before we continue, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindora if you believe kindness can reach even the hardest heart and that everyone deserves a second chance. And tell us where you are watching from today, because somewhere across the world, your kindness may be exactly what another person needs to believe that they are not alone. The woman's name was Mireya Bell, a 42-year-old home care worker who had spent most of her life helping people who rarely remembered to thank her. She lived alone in the house her mother had left behind, surviving on long shifts, overdue bills, and the quiet ache of being judged before anyone learned her name. Strangers noticed her sighs before they noticed her tired eyes. Employers described her as dependable but overlooked her for promotions. Men had treated her as though affection were something she should feel grateful to receive in crumbs. Yet Mireya remained gentle, not because life had been gentle with her, but because she knew how deeply cruelty could settle inside a person. 3 nights earlier, during a violent thunderstorm, Mireya had heard scratching beneath her porch. She found Atlas soaked, trembling, and bleeding from a cut along his side. His expensive harness was torn, and the tracking device attached to it had been smashed. Although the massive dog frightened her, she knelt in the rain and spoke softly until he allowed her to come closer. She cleaned his wound, covered him with her mother's old quilt, and slept on the kitchen floor beside him because every clap of thunder made his body shake. By morning, Atlas had stopped growling. By the second night, he followed Mireya from room to room. By the third, he placed his head in her lap and closed his eyes as though he had finally found somewhere safe enough to rest. Mireya had already contacted local shelters and veterinarians, but before anyone could trace the dog's owner, Cashin's men found a traffic camera image showing Atlas near her street. Cashin did not believe in coincidence. Atlas was not simply a pet. He had been trained to detect danger, shield Cashin during attacks, and obey only a small set of commands. The dog had disappeared after Cashin's convoy was ambushed outside the city. 2 men had been injured, and Atlas had chased one of the attackers into the woods. Cashin had searched for him without sleeping, though he told no one that the dog was the last living connection to his younger brother, who had raised Atlas before dying 5 years earlier. Standing in Mireya's yard, Cashin repeated the command in a voice that had made powerful men tremble. Atlas's ears moved, proving he understood. Yet instead of crossing the distance, the dog stepped in front of Mireya and pressed his body against her legs. When one of the guards approached, Atlas bared his teeth, not at Mireya, but at the armed men surrounding her. Then he gently took Mireya's sleeve between his teeth and pulled her backward toward the house, shielding her with his entire body. Everyone froze. Atlas had never disobeyed Cashin. Cashin's shock hardened into suspicion. He accused Mireya of drugging or manipulating the dog, but she refused to shrink beneath his stare. With tears still clinging to her lashes, she told him that Atlas had arrived terrified and injured, and that whatever kind of life he had lived, he had been afraid to return to it. Her words struck harder than an insult because Cashin knew fear when he saw it. He had built his empire by making others afraid, yet he had convinced himself that Atlas's obedience was loyalty. Watching the dog protect a woman he had known for only 3 days forced Cashin to confront a truth he had avoided for years. Perhaps Atlas had not chosen Mireya because he had forgotten his owner. Perhaps he had chosen her because she had offered something Cashin's world never had, peace. Before Cashin could respond, Atlas suddenly began barking toward one of the SUVs. His body stiffened, and he lunged toward the rear wheel. A guard reached beneath the vehicle and discovered a small transmitter attached to the chassis. Someone had been tracking Cashin's movements. At that exact moment, a delivery van at the end of the road accelerated toward the house. Atlas knocked Mireya behind a stone planter just as gunfire shattered the morning air. Cashin's men returned fire while neighbors screamed and ducked away from windows. The attack lasted less than a minute, but when silence returned, Atlas was lying on the pavement. Mireia crawled toward him before anyone could stop her. Blood darkened the fur near his shoulder, and his breathing came in shallow bursts. She pressed both hands against the wound, begging him to remain awake. Cashin dropped to his knees on the opposite side. For the first time, Mireia saw no mafia boss, no cold ruler, no man surrounded by fear. She saw someone terrified of losing the last creature he loved. They rushed Atlas to a private veterinary hospital. Cashin waited outside the operating room with blood on his white cuffs while Mireia sat beside him, still wearing slippers and the purple sweater she had thrown on when the SUVs arrived. Hours passed. Neither spoke much. Yet in that sterile hallway, two people from entirely different worlds began to understand each other. Cashin admitted that his brother had died because of choices Cashin had made. Afterward, he had turned grief into control, believing that if everyone obeyed him, he would never be helpless again. Mireia quietly told him that control could keep people near, but it could never make them stay in their hearts. She knew because she had spent years trying to become smaller, quieter, and easier to love. Eventually, she had realized that anyone who required her to disappear did not truly want her presence. Atlas survived the surgery, but the veterinarian warned that his recovery would be long. When Cashin entered the room, the dog weakly lifted his head. Cashin reached for him, expecting Atlas to respond as he always had. Instead, Atlas searched past him until he saw Mireia standing at the doorway. His tail moved once against the blanket. Mireia approached, and Atlas placed one paw over her hand. Then, with visible effort, he stretched his other paw toward Cashin. The gesture left the room silent. Atlas was not choosing one of them over the other. He was asking them to stop treating love as possession. He had protected Cashin for years, and Mireia had protected him when he was helpless. In his own simple way, he was joining two wounded lives that had forgotten how to trust. Cashin made a decision that stunned his entire organization. He allowed Atlas to recover at Mireia's home, but he came every day to help. At first, the neighborhood feared his visits. Gradually, the SUVs disappeared, the armed guards remained farther away, and Cashin began arriving alone. He repaired Mireia's broken porch, carried bags of dog food into the kitchen, and sat on the floor while she changed Atlas's bandages. Mireia never excused his past, and Cashin never asked her to. Instead, she challenged him to decide what kind of man he wished to become next. Over the following months, Cashin dismantled the most violent parts of his empire and turned several legitimate businesses toward community work. It was not an instant transformation, and it did not erase the harm he had caused. But for the first time, he stopped hiding behind the idea that powerful men could not change. He funded an emergency veterinary clinic for families who could not afford treatment and placed Mireia in charge of its outreach program, not as a favor, but because she had the compassion and courage the project needed. Mireia changed too. She stopped apologizing for taking up space. She wore bright colors, laughed loudly, and stood before donors without lowering her eyes. People who once dismissed her began listening when she spoke, but the greatest change was not how the world saw her. It was how she saw herself. Atlas had trusted her before she had fully learned to trust her own worth. Months later, during the clinic's opening ceremony, Cashin stood beside Mireia while Atlas rested between them, healed and strong. A reporter asked who the dog belonged to. Cashin looked down as Atlas leaned against Mireia's leg while keeping one paw on Cashin's shoe. For the first time in his life, Cashin smiled without calculation. He explained that Atlas belonged to no one. They belonged to each other. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a meaningful comment, and subscribe to Kindora. Your support helps stories of kindness, courage, and second chances reach people who may be struggling silently. Special request, comment, love doesn't control, it protects, if you believe genuine love gives people safety without taking away their freedom. Atlas had stunned everyone by refusing to leave Mireia, but his greatest act was not disobedience. It was showing a feared man and a forgotten woman that love is not proven by ownership, power, or perfect obedience. It is proven by who remains beside us when we are wounded, who protects us when we cannot protect ourselves, and who helps us become gentler than the life we have lived. On the morning Cashin came to take his dog back, he believed he was reclaiming something that belonged to him. Instead, Atlas gave him something he had never truly possessed before, a family built not through fear, but through choice.